General Hospital spoilers for next week from August 18th to 22nd reveal that the strange, almost unbreakable bond between Lisel and Rocco had once been dismissed by those in Port Charles as nothing more than the lingering affection of a grieving woman clinging to the last living thread. The T connected her to her daughter, Britt. For months, it had been tolerated, even indulged, by the community. As if keeping Rocco close to Lisel was an act of kindness for a woman who had already lost too much. But recently, something about this attachment had shifted. It was no longer benign. No longer just sentiment. The air around it had thickened with something harder, more possessive, and far more unsettling. Lisel had begun appearing everywhere Rocco went. Always with the excuse of protection. She was at his school, his swim practices, the community park, never far enough away to be uninvolved, never close enough to be openly challenged. At first, Lulu had brushed it off as overzealous concern. But there was something in the way Lisel hovered, always just at the edge of every conversation. Watching with an intensity that made it feel as though she was memorizing every movement, every word. And there was something in Rocco's behavior that made Lulu's unease grow. He had become quieter, more guarded, and when she asked where he had been or who he'd been with, his answers were short, sometimes evasive. More troubling still were the moments when he would say, "Lisel told me not to tell you," his tone carrying a weight far beyond a child's usual secrets. This secrecy was the first fracture in what had once been an open, trusting relationship between mother and son. Dante could see the tension building but resisted jumping to conclusions. He remembered the debts they owed Lisel. Moments when her intervention had helped them, times she had stood on their side. But that history didn't erase the growing reality. Lisel was embedding herself so deeply into Rocco's life that removing her now would be messy, complicated, and potentially devastating to the boy. Every conversation with Rocco was calculated to reinforce her role as an essential figure in his life. She spoke to him of Britt in ways that blurred the lines between memory and obligation, weaving a quiet narrative in which Rocco became the keeper of Britt's spirit. She hinted at dangers only she could protect him from, dangers vague enough to be terrifying but impossible to prove. Rocco's schedule was shifting without her consent. A lesson was cancelled here, a new activity added there, changes often, suggested, by Lisel and somehow accepted by the boy without question. Teachers and coaches began to speak of Lisel's recommendations, as though she were a legal guardian. Even more disturbing, neighbors started seeing her as a caring, involved figure, reinforcing the public perception that she was a harmless presence. That perception made it harder for Lulu and Dante to take action without looking cold or vindictive. But inside their home, the situation was eroding their control as parents. Conversations about boundaries turned into arguments. Dante, torn between loyalty to Lulu and his lingering gratitude toward Lisel, urged caution. Lulu, feeling the encroachment every day, argued that the longer they hesitated, the harder it would be to reclaim Rocco's trust. She could see him slipping away, retreating into a private space where Lisel's words carried more weight than hers. The most alarming change was in Rocco's demeanor. He had always been a straightforward child, quick to share his thoughts, but now he was more defensive, sometimes angry, when asked about his time with Lisel. He repeated phrases that sounded rehearsed, like lines fed to him. There was an odd intensity in his eyes when he talked about keeping Britt's memory alive, as though this mission had been elevated to something sacred. She was positioning herself not just as someone Rocco loved, but as someone he needed, someone he couldn't navigate the world without. She offered him special experiences and activities that excluded his parents, framing them as rewards for his trust. The secrecy these moments required was masked as a game, a safe adventure. But the effect was to build a wall between him and Lulu and Dante. At night, Lulu found herself replaying every interaction in her mind. The easy laughter, all were being replaced by guarded silences and closed doors. Dante was starting to see it too, though he still clung to the belief that they could handle it quietly. But Lulu knew better. Lisel wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was accelerating. The new, calculated shift in her behavior was unmistakable. She was no longer content to simply be present, she was orchestrating Rocco's environment. Friends were chosen carefully. Coaches and mentors were subtly swayed. Even family gatherings became arenas where she could demonstrate her closeness to Rocco, always making sure others noticed. And in doing so, she wasn't just influencing the boy, she was altering the way the world saw him, and them. This left Lulu and Dante trapped in a dilemma with no good options. Push Lisel away too forcefully. And they risked alienating Rocco further, or worse, turning him completely against them. Let her continue, and they risked losing their place in his inner circle altogether. The question hanging over them now was not just how to stop her, but why she was doing this. Was this truly about clinging to Britt's memory, or was there something deeper? Darker, some motive that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with power? Lulu had started to suspect the latter, sensing that Rocco might be just one piece in a larger plan. And if that was true, then the new level of madness they were experiencing was only the beginning. For now, all they could do was watch, plan, and hope that they could find a way to reclaim their son before the invisible threads binding him to Lisel became unbreakable. But deep down, Lulu feared they were already running out of time. The tension between Drew and Willow began as a subtle shift but quickly grew into a dangerous standoff. Drew's behavior turned precise, deliberate, almost clinical, his conversations with Willow framed like negotiations, every pause calculated. He carried with him a folder that never left his side, claiming it held the only truth that mattered. Evidence tying Willow to an alleged attempt to kidnap Daisy. Inside were edited clips, suspicious timestamps, and partial witness accounts that painted a damning picture. None of it proved guilt outright, but together it created a narrative dangerous enough to destroy her credibility. Willow knew the material could be twisted to sound convincing, especially in a town where rumor often outweighed fact. Drew's obsession had hardened into strategy, his demands framed as protection, let him dictate custody arrangements and access to the children. Or risk the story gaining momentum. The first shock was realizing how fully he'd prepared, building an ecosystem of half-truths and manipulated evidence. Willow moved cautiously, balancing an outward calm with a constant internal calculation. She sought legal advice, knowing attempted kidnapping could shadow her even if unfounded. She tried to contact Daisy, but the woman's elusive nature made her an unreliable ally. Meanwhile, Drew pressed his advantage, sending formal schedules. The story grew ribs and muscle, shaping how neighbors looked at her. The children sensed the tension, their games now involving locked doors and secret passwords. Willow understood she couldn't simply deny the accusation, she had to counter it. She began compiling her own file, receipts, affidavits, raw footage requests, and a list of neutral witnesses. She sought experts to analyze the supposed evidence, looking for flaws in Drew's carefully staged narrative. Drew noticed her resolve. He tried softening his approach, evoking memories of better days. But even his tenderness was edged with control. Willow stopped explaining her refusals. She limited their interactions, avoided unmediated spaces, and secured her own safe filled with resources and contacts. Her silence became a form of resistance, forcing Drew into a position his script hadn't prepared him for. Then the dynamic shifted. Daisy vanished again, a witness placed her elsewhere during the alleged incident, and metadata undermined Drew's timeline. A judge questioned his chain of custody, making fabrication an unspoken possibility in the room. The leverage he'd relied on began to lose its weight. The damage, however, was real. The house remained quieter than before. The children's games still shaped by secrecy, and Willow still woke early to prepare for battles that might never come. Yet the axis had turned, Drew's narrative was being examined, not obeyed. His blackmail named for what it was. The inflated catastrophe shrank back to the petty gambit it had always been. What Willow kept from the ordeal were the habits that made her stronger. Documenting everything, refusing to be bullied by insinuation, building a network instead of waiting for rescue. The future, once something Drew tried to pre-write. Jason's confrontation with Britt was never going to be a quiet or simple conversation. But the way it unfolded carried a gravity that made it feel less like a personal disagreement and more like the first tremor of something far larger. They had been intense moments before. Moments where truth and deception danced close enough to touch, but this time there was no room for the half-smiles or strategic retreats that had once allowed them to sidestep the real conflict. This time, there was an edge in Jason's voice and a guarded steel in Britt's eyes that suggested neither of them intended to back down, no matter what it cost. The cadence of his words felt different, controlled, deliberate, and designed to box her in. Britt noticed it instantly. In response, she adjusted her own tactics, keeping her answers tight, clipped. As if every sentence added weight to an already dangerous balance. These changes weren't just about personalities clashing, they were the product of deeper, deliberate recalibrations. So she tightened her grip on the truth like someone clutching the last lifeline in a storm. The more they adjusted to each other's defenses, the further they moved from the uneasy truce they'd once maintained. There was no illusion of mutual benefit anymore, only the certainty that one of them would come out of this with control. And the other would lose it. And beneath that battle for dominance, there was the shadow of something much worse. This wasn't just about them. The information Britt was holding back. The answers Jason was determined to extract were tied to forces and consequences that extended far beyond the two of them. Every word carried the potential to spark a chain reaction. And both knew it. Jason's questions began to circle closer to the heart of what Britt was hiding, brushing up against names and events she had kept sealed off for months. Britt's eyes would flash in warning when he crossed too close to the line, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere in her deflections was the truth he needed, and with every evasion she gave him, his resolve only hardened. Britt, for her part, understood the danger in giving him what he wanted. If she admitted too much. There were people, powerful people, who had a vested interest in those truths never seeing daylight, and Britt had no illusions about what they would do if she became a liability. The more they both sensed that the moment for choice was slipping away. The confrontation was no longer a temporary flare of anger, it was evolving into something foundational. Something that would define how they moved forward from here. Every change in tone, every adjustment in their approach, was another step toward a breaking point neither of them could fully see but both could feel looming. The danger now was that they were no longer speaking only to each other. Every glance, every refusal, every pointed word was sending messages to the wider network of allies, enemies, and opportunists circling around them. If this tension spilled over, and it was dangerously close, there would be no containing it. The disaster brewing between Jason and Britt wasn't theoretical anymore. It was here, in the room with them. Growing with every passing second, waiting for one slip, one push, one miscalculation to ignite it into something that would change everything. They were deliberate moves in a battle for control, and every move carried the risk of pulling them both into a disaster that could burn far beyond their reach. And the worst part was that both of them knew it, yet neither showed any sign of stepping back. Vaughn's descent into danger didn't happen in a single moment. It was the product of a slow tightening of the noose. A steady sequence of changes in the rules of the game that no one had publicly acknowledged, but everyone on the inside could feel. The shift was subtle at first, buried under the ordinary chaos of Port Charles, but now it had become impossible to ignore. Vaughn wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, he had been maneuvered, piece by piece, into a position where his vulnerability could be exploited. And the more Jocelyn pieced together, the clearer it became that this was not an accident. Someone had altered the playing field itself. And the resulting trouble was bigger, sharper, and more dangerous than anything they had faced before. For Jocelyn, this realization hit like a cold slap. She'd been tracking Vaughn's moves for days, sensing that the net around him was drawing tighter, but she hadn't been prepared for the speed at which things would escalate. One moment, his problems seemed like something they could untangle with enough finesse. The next, his life was hanging in the balance. It was as if someone had flipped a switch in the background, a deliberate adjustment that took everything they thought they knew and rewired it into a trap. Vaughn's survival wasn't going to depend on chance or luck, it was going to depend on how quickly and decisively she could act. That meant stepping into territory she deliberately kept her distance from, a direct confrontation with Britt. For weeks, Britt had been an enigma, a mix of familiar face and unfamiliar motives. Someone who could be warm and disarming in one breath and a wall of ice in the next. Jocelyn had kept her suspicions close, waiting for the moment when the cracks in Britt's story would reveal something solid. Vaughn's predicament was that moment. It ripped away the last excuse Jocelyn had for holding back. There was no time left for quiet observation or careful maneuvering. If she didn't move now, the people behind Vaughn's situation would finish what they'd started. But with clarity, the understanding that this was more than a personal disagreement, more than a clash over loyalties. Britt was not acting alone. And Jocelyn intended to force her to show the hand she'd been hiding. From the first moment they locked eyes, the tension was thick enough to cut. Britt's expression was calculated. She'd suspected for weeks that there was a force behind Britt, someone or something with the resources to shape events, the power to move pieces around the board without leaving fingerprints. And now, in the heat of their standoff, Britt's subtle glance toward a point beyond Jocelyn gave it away. She wasn't just working with someone. She was answering to someone. The exchange between them was more than verbal sparring, it was a collision of agendas. Jocelyn demanded answers, not in vague terms. For the identity of the people pulling the strings. Britt deflected, but her deflections were too quick, too rehearsed, and every one of them confirmed the scale of the danger Vaughn was facing. She wasn't just a bystander trying to save a friend, she was inserting herself into a network that had already decided who lived and who didn't. And Britt, whether she wanted to admit it or not, was the conduit between Jocelyn and that network. Every question Jocelyn asked was a hammer blow against the thin wall Britt had built to protect her handler's anonymity. The confrontation escalated quickly, shifting from accusation to warning. Jocelyn made it clear she wasn't leaving without a lead on Vaughn, while Britt made it equally clear that Jocelyn's interference was not just unwelcome, it was dangerous. But the danger didn't scare Jocelyn anymore, it clarified her. Vaughn's life was the priority. And the only way to save him was to pierce the veil Britt was standing behind. By the time the conversation ended, the lines were drawn. Jocelyn had her confirmation, Britt's allegiances weren't her own, and the shadow behind her was as real as the threat closing in on Vaughn. Whatever happened next, Jocelyn knew she was no longer just trying to protect one man. She was walking straight into a fight with an entire apparatus built to operate in darkness, and the moment she stepped into that space, there would be no going back. And somewhere behind Britt's guarded eyes, that unseen presence had surely taken note, marking Jocelyn as someone who had not only seen too much, but someone who might just be willing to burn everything down to bring Vaughn back alive. Chase and Willow's connection had always carried a certain undercurrent. But recently it had begun to surge with an intensity neither of them could ignore. What had once been polite, friendly exchanges were now charged moments, weighted with glances that lingered too long. Conversations that drifted into territory far too personal for two people who were supposed to have clear boundaries. This wasn't just nostalgia or old familiarity resurfacing, it was something active. She'd been accustomed to being in the center of Chase's attention, able to anticipate his moods, steer his choices, and hold a certain influence over his emotional compass. But now, every attempt to reassert that position seemed to land flat. Chase listened less, responded with polite detachment, and seemed more distracted whenever Willow entered the room. Brooke Lynn could sense the story slipping away from her, like she was no longer the co-author but an observer watching someone else take over the narrative she thought she controlled. The new control, in this situation, wasn't hers anymore, it belonged to the quiet but undeniable pull between Chase and Willow. They shared a rhythm now. An ease that was laced with unspoken attraction and the kind of trust that only grows in the absence of judgment. It was the kind of connection that made decisions come easier. Conversations run longer, and silences feel safe instead of strained. For Chase, it was intoxicating. For Brooke Lynn, it was the beginning of the end. The realization came to Chase gradually but firmly, his marriage had become a structure he was holding together out of habit rather than love. He began to see Brooke Lynn not as a partner who shared his vision, but as someone trying to manage him, to contain him, to preserve a version of their life that no longer matched who he was becoming. With Willow, he felt the opposite. There was no need to pretend, no pressure to fit into a mold, no constant negotiation over control. As their interactions deepened, Chase stopped fighting the truth. And the more he let himself lean into those moments, the more the idea of staying in a marriage with Brooklyn felt like a betrayal to them both. When the decision came, it wasn't explosive. It was clear, decisive, and without theatrics. Chase told Brooklyn he wanted a divorce. The reasons were layered: years of mismatched priorities, an erosion of trust, and now, the undeniable pull towards someone else. While the mention of Willow's name was not the centerpiece of his explanation, it hovered in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Replaced by a new chapter unfolding between Chase and Willow, a chapter built on authenticity, emotional freedom, and a love that felt less like a performance and more like a truth they had both been moving toward for a long time.